Hi everyone, this is Keith Stone here again with Gregory, Nagy, and Janet and Sarah from the Cuttlefish Society at HeroesX to talk about Penelope and morality in Homeric poetry and Hesiodic poetry, lots of things. Why don't we start with the Penelope thread, because that was really interesting, I thought.
And Keith, are you punning when you said Penelope thread?
I am, unconsciously.
Because so many people picked up on the skills of Penelope as a weaver, as a fabric worker, which is so important for the metaphorical world of Homeric poetry in general. Homeric poetry compares itself to the art of a fabric worker. And so to see Penelope actually being a master of that form of art, which is, of course, a material art, but which is in many ways perfectly parallel to the verbal art of Homeric poetry, and to other visual arts like painting, and the list goes on and on, pottery, painting on pottery, so on. So whatever the etymology of Penelope is, and by etymology I mean a scientific establishment of what the elements in the word actually come from, it's true that Penelope as a name has lived through so many phases of Homeric tradition. I would say 500 years, 1,000 years, maybe more. That certainly the meaning of pene, as in thread on a bobbin, is, as one of our participants pointed out, something that is an obvious mental association, even though it's not necessarily the etymology for the word, for the name. And I especially liked the way the discussion developed, the way the thread developed, and how there was a clear understanding that somehow what Penelope does with weaving is relevant to Odysseus and the spinning out, no pun intended, of his story, the story of the Odyssey, which is so vitally dependent on her story. But also, and I think this is even more important, that whenever she unweaves the web, what she is engaging in, and this was picked up in the discussions, what she does by undoing the web is undoing the memory of the verbal art that really should, and in fact must, celebrate her fame, her Klaus, which is something that the Klaus of Odysseus depends on. As we know in Odyssey 24, the epic of the Odyssey cannot happen without the contribution of Penelope, and that contribution is visualized by way of her skill in weaving, but also her skill in unweaving, which would mean undoing the story just to be able to redo it again. And I'd love to hear from Sarah and from Janet about their reactions, and yours too, dear Keith, to these responses we got, because I think we're really building up a head of steam. I sense that not only are people getting it, but they're connecting dots in ways that that warm my old heart, and I think are ways that are extremely creative for understanding the whole Odyssey. So, dear Sarah, dear Janet, dear Keith, what do you think?
Some people were comparing the relationship between Penelope and Odysseus to the relationship between Patroclus and Achilles. In what sense are, I mean, we talked a lot about Patroclus and Achilles in the Iliad. So in what sense can we say that Penelope is a double of Odysseus, or his equal, or could she be his therapone, ritual substitute in some sense?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And there was considerable disagreement on that. I remember there was quite a bit of pushback from some participants about using the word therapon. I didn't mind the use of it, but I certainly don't think that Penelope is programmed to die for Odysseus. So maybe that's one of the reasons we can think of other ways of exploring overlaps in identity, interweavings in identity. But still, even if you thought that therapon was something good to think with, I think in a way it was, because it certainly explores, that word explores interchangeability of identities. And that, you can say, is true for Odysseus and Penelope. And to repeat, his kleos really depends on her kleos. Just as the Agamemnon kleos is messed up by the Clytemnestra kleos, so to speak, as again we learn in Odyssey 24.
Or also comparing Penelope to Athena.
I like that. Yes, that was another another thread. Again, no pun intended, surely. Another thread that was brought in by the participants, and I again very much appreciated that, because certainly Athena is outside Homeric poetry as well as inside Homeric poetry the patroness of fabric work. She is the ultimate weaver. My favorite part is where in the Iliad she turns out to have woven the at-home robe that she wears, and that's spelled out in the Iliad. So she's definitely the model fabric worker. And certainly for humans, Penelope is the model fabric worker.
Would you say that Penelope and Athena are antagonistic in the Odyssey? We talked last week about Penelope and how Athena influenced her by putting her to sleep, so to speak, on various occasions.
Yeah, that's a very clever line of thinking, which I haven't really followed through on myself, but I like the look and feel of it. I think that's a good way to go. I guess I was always so preoccupied with the antagonism between Odysseus and Athena, which is pretty serious, especially because of various unmentionable things that Odysseus does to violate his relationship with Athena when he's still fighting in the Trojan War. And I'm thinking especially of his stealing the palladium, which is this wooden object that is the icon of Athena. Now, I know that Homeric poetry plays that down. In fact, the palladium isn't mentioned once anywhere, not once, in either the Iliad or the Odyssey. But I certainly spent eternities trying to reconstruct that shady part of Odysseus's past from elsewhere. I think the offense of Odysseus against Athena is very much a subtext, so to speak, if I can speak metaphorically, in the Odyssey. It's very clear that Athena is angry at Odysseus, and that's why she's not there a lot of the times that Odysseus would have wished that she's there. In the end, of course, they make up, but it's tricky. But for Penelope, I must say, I've got to give that more thought.
So another thing that came up in this thread was talking about Odysseus's connection and relationship with Hermes. And again, yes, we've thought so much about Athena that we may have missed the ball on that, and they've really picked up on it. So I wondered if you could maybe say something about that.
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Sarah, because certainly Odysseus is a polytropic personality. By polytropic, I mean polytropos, somebody who can turn into many persons, many things, depending on the need for survival. That's the epithet, the ornamental adjective that Odysseus gets in Odyssey 1, line 1, polytropos, meaning he can turn into many different things. And that epithet can apply elsewhere only to Hermes, And Hermes in his role as a mercurial figure. I'm deliberately using the Latin word Mercury instead of the Greek word Hermes, because Mercury in medieval alchemy was polytropic. It was the substance that stood for versatility of the capacity to change from one metal to another, from one identity to the other. So yes, Odysseus is hermetic. And I'm so amused by the fact that although polytropos, this epithet of Odysseus in Odyssey 1:1, is used twice in the Homeric hymn to Hermes to designate Hermes as the shapeshifter, as the trickster, which is certainly a good model role for Odysseus in his trickster-like phases in the narrative. But I like the fact that even in the Odyssey, there is one other place where polytropos, meaning the one who can change into many persons or things, is used with reference to Odysseus. And that's when Odysseus has just overcome the magical powers of the beautiful witch Circe. And Circe says, "You're not by any chance Odysseus, polytropos, about whom Hermes spoke to me." Well, there it is, a signature, a hermetic signature that the Odyssey gives us. So I'm so glad you said that. And it's so typical of Odysseus that unlike Achilles, who really has one monolithic divine antagonist, and that's Apollo, Odysseus has to contend with, Poseidon, because he's a sailor. I mean, Odysseus is a sailor, and his number one divine antagonist is Poseidon. But then number two antagonist is Athena, and that's partly because they really do think alike. So aside from any questionable things that Odysseus might have done in the Trojan War, there's also the basic pattern that heroes tend to be antagonistic towards the gods that they resemble the most. And he certainly resembles Athena intellectually more than any other god. And then, of course, Hermes, as you, wonderful Sarah, pointed out. Hermes is not so much a representative of a state of mind, but versatility, just that kind of animal instinct to blend in. That's why Polytropos in other forms of poetry describes octopuses, because in Mediterranean folklore, it's well known that octopus can change colors within seconds. So it's not like a chameleon. It takes a much longer time. Octopuses are really quick in changing their superficial markers of identity. My favorite example is if you look down into clear Mediterranean water, maybe 10 feet down, and there's an octopus. If you put a checkerboard underneath the octopus, the surface of the octopus will develop checkerboard patterns within a very, very short amount of time. If you go to YouTube, you can actually see it. I think you look up octopus and checkerboard.
I think I've watched some of those videos.
I think I might have inflicted some of them on you, dear Keith. But dear friends, do you mind if I bring up something else about Penelope and the meaning of the name Penelope? And this is not obvious. This doesn't just leap at you. I think our readers already picked up on the most obvious verbal associations, especially having to do with Penelope's dexterity with fabric work. But I've got to tell you this. So it has to do with the work of a wonderful Russian colleague called Olga Levinu, who wrote a brilliant book on the Odyssey, especially Odyssey 19. And she notices that Penelopes is a word for some kind of a duck. And one of our respondents noticed that by digging deep into the dictionary world. But here's the thing, it turns out that this particular kind of duck, Penelopes, which would be a foundational form for Penelope, this kind of duck is a songbird. And we, at least where I come from, don't think of ducks as songbirds. I think of ducks going quack, quack, and not making a pretty sound, right? But apparently there are ducks that do sing. and sing pretty songs. And in many cultures, even a mandarin duck, believe it or not, can be thought of as a songbird. And now, may I do a reminiscence of a clipping that I once found, and this will just kill you. It has to do with something that was in a newspaper. I think Keith has heard it. Maybe Sarah and Janet, you haven't heard it. But in this newspaper, it talks about a pair of mandarin ducks that are owned by an owner. And surprise, 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 mandarin ducks are monogamous and they're very faithful to each other. And the male mandarin duck disappears. And so Mrs. Duck is extremely upset. And she is, may I put it in Odyssean terms, lamenting and lamenting and lamenting, but no avail. The male mandarin duck has disappeared. Now, this is all in a very mundane newspaper article, so I'm already adding too much color to it. Forgive me. But anyway, so one fine day, un bel dì, there is another male mandarin duck in the neighborhood, and he pays, shall we say, unwelcome attention to Mrs. Duck, and Mrs. Duck doesn't like this, and this alternative mandarin duck is courting and courting and courting the female mandarin duck. And again, I'm adding too much Odyssean color to this. And then another one fine day, the old mandarin duck, male duck, comes back. And here's what he does. He kills the new mandarin duck, the male mandarin duck. And the reason this made it into the news is that mandarin ducks are not violent, that you don't expect a male mandarin duck to do anything to another one. But I guess this was an Odyssean exception.
I love that. I don't think actually I have heard that story, Greg.
Oh, I wish I could find the clipping. It's somewhere in a scrapbook. And I think I even wrote down the date and the provenience of the newspaper. I think it was a Hong Kong newspaper, but I can't find it. But don't think I made it up. You can't make up something like this.
It's too good. It's too good to be true. We have a few minutes left, and I wanted to get your thoughts, Greg, on one more thing, which has to do with Homeric poetry versus Hesiodic poetry.
Yes.
And
yes.
The question on that, and the question of timing: is Hesiodic poetry later? Is it contemporaneous? And to what extent is Hesiod a person?
Yes. Yes.
Well.
No, I think you touched all bases, and here's the way I would address it: is I wish I had made more clear in the way I phrased my question that the answer doesn't depend on relative earliness or lateness of Hesiodic poetry and Homeric poetry. If we had 100 more hours, I think I could prove to you conclusively that Hesiodic poetry is just as old as Homeric poetry. That is to say, you can't really say, oh, Hesiodic poetry comes from a different world than Homeric poetry. It comes from the same world, but the poetry plays by different rules. And in the trade, we call Hesiodic poetry wisdom poetry. Wisdom poetry tends to be much more personalized, where the only way you can really express morality is to have the speaker of the poetry be somehow a representative of moral situations. So in that way, it's already different from Homeric poetry, where what do we know about the person who tells the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey? Nothing, or practically nothing. Whereas we know a lot of things about the Hesiod persona. But that all has to do with, frankly, poetic conventions. And if we added the Homeric hymn to Apollo to the Iliad and the Odyssey, we'd say, oh, we know a lot about Homer as well. So it's just a matter of the bad fortune that Homeric hymn to Apollo is considered separate from the Iliad and the Odyssey. It used to be part of Iliad and the Odyssey. It could be a way of introducing either the Iliad or the Odyssey, okay? And then you'd say, oh, well, Homer has a personality too, just as Hesiod does. But here's the thing. because it's a different kind of poetry, let's use the $10 word genre. It's a different kind of poetry. It doesn't have to do with later or earlier phases of Greek oral poetry. It's pretty much the same world, as I said before, that generates this kind of verbal art. But I can tell you, every second verse in Hesiodic poetry, there's a statement about this is wrong, this is right, this is right, this is wrong. Or can we use Greek words, dike and hubris? It's really spelled out. And then what really is remarkable is how that almost never happens in either the Iliad or the Odyssey. When does the master narrator, as I like to refer to him, ever say, well, when Achilles says, I wish I could, I'm so angry at you, Hector, that I wish I could cut you up and eat your body raw. Does the narration say afterwards, and that was a wrong thing to say? No, it just doesn't. And what it does do is it leaves the moral judgment to the listener. And that has to do with different forms of poetry. And one of the few places where we see that the Iliad, for example, deliberately stands back from making a moral judgment is on the Shield of Achilles, where we see the litigation between a plaintiff and a defendant. And it's all about right and wrong. And there are people surrounding the litigation. There are senior people in the inner circle. There's everybody else in the outer circle. And everybody's being put on the spot. Well, who's right and who's wrong? But even there, it's a description of how everybody who surrounds the action is making a judgment of who's right and wrong, but the actual master narrator does not. And it's distinctive of Homeric poetry. Obviously, I'm arguing that it's a matter of genre. It's not a matter of earlier or later worldviews. And I'm sorry if I misled some of our wonderful participants in implying that we're shifting worldviews. We're just, I'd rather say, looking at the world from different angles.
And was the performance, Greg, could I just ask, was the performance tradition of Hesiodic poetry similar or different? Do we know much about it? Would there have been, as it were, an audience participating in that as well, like the people surrounding the litigants?
Yes, thank you. I am sure there would have been. I'm sure there would have been. And it's easier to see in the Theogony. It's harder to see in the Works and Days because it looks like Hesiod is speaking to this good-for-nothing brother. But I think if we understand that, let's use that $10 word, mimesis, or mimesis, we say in English, reenactment, you could have a performance in front of a very similar audience or group for Hesiodic poetry as you could for, I think, epic. It's just that the performer has to play a different role. And it's like, well, I hesitate to talk about modern analogies because that always messes us up, because let's face it, we're not in a traditional society. We don't live in the kind of song culture that they lived in. But you know the expression one-man show, where one performer kind of does a jack of all trades, reenactment of a whole bunch of other characters, all as one performer. So just because Hesiod is talking to his brother doesn't mean that we have to imagine a staging where there's Hesiod and then some dummy who just stands there and listens and doesn't say anything. In fact, the best giveaway for the fact that this must be some kind of solo performance is that the unworthy brother never gets to say a word.
Right, that's a good point.
So it's not that Perses, the bad brother of the good brother Hesiod, has a voice. He doesn't. You know what it reminds me of is when I used to drive my child to school, and we had a defective audio system for playing fun things, and I tried to cheer him up by playing Beatles, but the trouble is the loudspeaker worked only on his side and not my side of the car. So we never heard John and Paul. We only heard George and Ringo.
Oh, wow. That's
And I kind of remember the Beatles that way. I really like George and Ringo because I was deprived of John and Paul.
that worked out pretty well then.
I was wondering about Hesiodic tradition in the Panhellenic sense. Where do you put it?
Yeah. Well, I would say, I would like to say that even Hesiodic tradition evolved in Athens more than anywhere else. And somebody that I often disagree with, Martin West, and his commentary on the Hesiodic theogony says, and I think it's very wise, that the farther along you go in the theogony, and let's say you're now at line 700, now you're at line 800, and I know we don't really encourage people to read too much into that later part of the theogony, but if you wanted to read the later part, what West says about it is that it starts getting more and more and more Athenian, and I think he can prove it, and I do agree with it, that it's an evolutionary medium where it becomes more and more and more suited as it evolves and as it gets bigger, as the circles keep getting broader and broader to an Athenian context. So I like to think of it, Hesiodic poetry, as something that developed further north in Boeotia, but then in the late 500s really got rooted in Athens itself, where it developed a distinctly Athenian patina. I'm sorry about that. That was maybe a little too I don't know, eye, ear, nose, throat an answer, but and it's certainly not something I used to think of when I was younger. But in my later years, I very much see an Athenian stamp. Just as I see an Athenian stamp, of course, also in the Iliad and the Odyssey. But that's not really relevant to what the wonderful people out there were, what I just said. Your question is very relevant. My question is not so relevant. Maybe a good way to end the conversation is to say that if people would like to look on the website of the Center for Hellenic Studies, a book that I did called Homer the Pre-Classic. There I analyze all these wonderful myths about Homer and Hesiod having a contest, a real shootout at OK Corral, where the narrative tells about how they try to outdo each other about who's the better poet, and they quote back at each other their greatest hits. And of course it's a myth, but myths have a way of telling us about the worldview of the song culture that produced these two amazing culture heroes of poetry that we know of as Hesiodic and Homeric poetry. So it's a lot of fun, and it's called the Contest of Homer and Hesiod. And it is a contest that's held in front of a huge aggregate of Greeks who were then asked to judge, who do you like better? And it's interesting, the people vote for Homer, but the king who is attending says, oh no, Homer can't get the prize, Hesiod gets the prize. Go figure.
I want to read more about that. All right. Well, thanks, Greg. Thanks, Janet.
Well, thank you, all three of you. I had so much fun. I'm sorry to do so much talking, but I really enjoyed myself.
Great.
Thank you.
See you all next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.